Hi everyone. Today is my pleasure to welcome you to this the penultimate public program in our Fall 2020 series, and I'm very excited that we have two great architects and writers with us. But I'll begin by sharing with you that the rest of the talks of this Fall 2020 series are online, and there are videos that you can watch. They're on our website. And to urge you to also RSVP for our next one, in which some of the editorial teams that were selected as part of the American Roundtable project by the Architectural League of New York are going to be presenting their findings. And the three groups are in North Carolina, West Virginia, and Ohio, specifically as they relate to landscape. This series of talks are also part of the CUDC's 20th anniversary, 20 years in Cleveland, that we hope to continue to celebrate as the pandemic has put a little bit of a damper into our celebration spirits, but we can do it. Next, I want to introduce you to Robert Lane and Nina Rappaport. Robert Lane is the principal and Plan and Process LLC, and he is the senior fellow for urban design at the Regional Planning Association, where he directs the regional design program devoted to reforming the metropolitan landscape through research and place-based planning and design interventions. Industrial district design and redevelopment has been a particular area of focus for his research, publication, exhibition, and lecturing work. Robert is also a Flood Fellow from the Harvard Graduate School of Design during the 2008-2009 academic year. And he was also a 2013 Fellow at the Design Trust for Public Space for the Making Midtown Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob. Nina Rappaport. Nina Rappaport is an architectural historian, curator, and educator. She focuses on industrial urbanism, infrastructure, and the role of the factory worker. She's author of Vertical Urban Factory 2015, which includes an exhibition and a think tank of the same name. She's the co-editor of the Ezra Stroller Photographer 2012, and author of Support and Resist, Structural Engineers and Design Innovation 2007. She is publications director at the Yale School of Architecture and was a fellow of the Design Trust for Public Space in 2006. She's a lecturer at the Michael Graves College of Public Architecture at Kean University and has taught in many New York City area schools. She writes for numerous journals and lectures internationally. I also, the last thing I want to do while I still have you here is I'm going to be putting a link to this, to urge you to, this is Robert's and Nina's book. So we're going to be putting a link in our thing. It's also nice to be among fellow Design Trust fellows. And I know Susan Chin is now in the Zoom. So thank you all. And thanks so much for sharing with us what you have learned, Nina and Rob.
Great. I'm going to go to share screen for a minute. 1 second. I can do this. Share screen. Do you see that? View. Slideshow. Great.
You can see it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Killian, for inviting us to speak and to give a book talk on this great occasion of launching a new book in this difficult time of COVID. Killian and I have collaborated on projects and ideas, and Rob has as well with him. And we're all Design Trust fellows. So it's a really wonderful way to kind of celebrate and tell more people about our project. So I just wanted to open with explaining the book a little bit, and then Rob will speak about the urban design and planning issues that we've been working on, and I'll talk more specifically about the architecture and some policy issues, and then we'll have time for questions. So just to show you the organization of the book, which it came out with Routledge. It is a collection of essays by planners, architects, policymakers, urban designers, and sociology, economic related folks. The idea was that we created a kind of three-part organization, first focusing on districts and the design of industrial districts. Then we divide the sections with different graphic essays to show some of this work. Then the second section is about the design and the architecture of actual manufacturing spaces. And the last section is about the design of policy and how to get cities and organizations to work to retain manufacturing. Then the last section is a comprehensive atlas study of cities around the US primarily, and how they organize their space to also allow for industrial uses. In that, we have about 15 essays, all varied, but all with this general theme and focus of the fact that we want to encourage manufacturing in cities in whatever form it takes. So we all share that kind of ideology and perspective of how to do it. It was a great collaborative project. Rob and I worked as the editors of the book, and then with contributions from these authors who did a great deal of work, original research, as well as focusing on very interesting case studies. So with that, I want to turn it over to Rob I'm going to stop sharing, sorry, my screen, and Rob will start with the discussion on the urban design. Oops.
Great, thank you, Nina. I mean, I just want to add one thing, which is that the authors are a mixture of both professionals, practitioners, and academics. And we feel like the book actually is targeted to both of those audiences. Before I get into the kind of more detailed part of my talk, and I'm going to run my timer because I'm going to try to do this in 20 minutes so that we have time for questions. It's just a couple of very high-arching themes. The first one being, there's a huge question about what manufacturing is, how we even define it. And for those of you who are practitioners and have to write use lists and other kind of policy things, you realize how difficult this is. Manufacturing is changing at tremendous speed, and the ability to define it has a lot to do with the other policy implications. Agglomeration versus protection. I would say this is the crux of the problem, is that on the one hand, we know that manufacturing, especially higher value manufacturing, thrives in the urban environment where it can take advantage of the kind of agglomeration economies of the city. But the problem is that also can lead to displacement, sometimes under the kind of Trojan horse of the quote unquote innovation district, which is often just code for kind of commercial gentrification. And of course, where this meets the ground in terms of design, and I'm going to talk about this a lot in a moment, is the edge and the decision of how much integration and connection do you create between the industrial district and its surrounding area. To what extent do you give in to the people who say, listen, we just have to put a wall around this stuff, versus the people who say, no, it needs to be everywhere and all at once. And then the last thing to think about is kind of interactions per square mile, which is usually the metric that we use to justify urban manufacturing. But in this kind of post-COVID world, I think it's interesting to think about the degree to which people have figured out how to do things remotely. And we may not be that far from the time when, rather than running down the street to get that part from the other guy, you have a file emailed to you from California and 3D printed. So these are issues that we're going to have to wrestle with. Basically, what we did was we came up with we selected these 18 places. We picked places based on not how sexy or beautiful they were, but on whether or not the cities seemed to have been making a sincere commitment towards actually making physical things. And we're doing interesting things from a policy point of view. Most of them are in North America, but there are some in Europe, in Italy, and in Barcelona. And what we did was, and you can see this little code at the bottom of each one, loft, neighborhood, and industrial park, because what we did was we actually came up with a kind of typology which we used to calibrate the various policy and design recommendations that we made. And we simplified a very complex landscape into these three major types of kind of the loft district, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of urban manufacturing, the kind of urban industrial park, sometimes called an in-place industrial park, and of course the mixed use neighborhood. What we found, and you can see it in this coding here, is that there are a few places that really do fit neatly into these categories, but most of the places are a mixture of all of them. But I think it has to be said that despite our association of urban manufacturing with the loft district, the reality is most of these places are low-rise in-place industrial parks, often anchored by a big mixed-use building, which becomes the flagship of that place. But the reality is they tend to be low-rise, one-story buildings, which present a set of very unique urban design and architectural challenges if you're trying to make a lively and working district. So the atlas looks at these places from different altitudes. At the scale of the region, what I would point out is that most of these places tend to be in this kind of sweet spot where they're close enough to the core, usually within a mile, that they can take advantage of the agglomeration economies of the rest of the city, but not in the places where real estate development pressures are at their highest. There are some great exceptions to this, including in Portland's, the east side of Portland and the Milwaukee 30th Street district. But in general, they're sort of in this sweet spot just at the edge of the core. And the other thing that's interesting is that all of them have some, or served usually by some form of significant infrastructure, often interestingly by rail, sometimes working, albeit at a very low level, or sometimes abandoned, but with the right of way still there. And we think that that access to water and rail will only become more important as we go forward. In terms of the built pattern of these places, what we find is that they're often, those places that are viable, often protected by at least one edge created by either water or a big piece of infrastructure. They are, as I said, largely one-story buildings. The other thing that I would kind of point out here is that how much the pattern varies, and you'll see that in a moment in the next slide, the street and block patterns, from being quite dense to quite broken up. So we actually looked at the street. And here, before I get to the street and block pattern, just the land use pattern tends to be, they all tend to be mixed to some extent, although generally commercial and industrial. There is not nearly as much residential industrial mixed use as there is in Europe. But even in those places where the areas within the formal district are almost all industrial, they tend to all be surrounded in quite close quarters with districts that are very mixed or highly residential. And so that's really important. And that edge between the industrial and the mixed use area is a central design issue. If you look at the street and block pattern of these places, I think the thing that I would want to point out, again, with some significant exceptions like Portland's Central East Side, or of course the New York City Garment District, is that the street and block pattern tends to be very much a kind of irregular, a lot of irregular blocks, a lot of discontinuities, and a lot of variation. And this is important because we think that those kind of odd conditions, which of course we as urban designers think, well, we have to kind of straighten this up and clean this up, is actually essential for the districts to work, because that variation in block size and connectivity enables you to accommodate the very many different configurations that are necessary for urban factories and urban manufacturing. So I'm going to go quickly through these. I'm not going to spend as much time on all of them as some of them, but these are sort of 8 kind of lessons learned for us about the kinds of priorities that should inform urban design for industrial districts, because we think that urban design for industrial districts is a unique challenge. It's not just kind of a lot of the standard things that we would do in urban design and other conditions. So for example, one of the lessons learned is that a diversity of block sizes and configurations is important. So again, if you look at that diagram on the upper right, what would you do as an urban designer? Well, you just extend the cross streets in, right? And we would say, no, you don't do that probably. You probably try to figure out a way to do something that is eccentric and that creates blocks of different sizes that can accommodate buildings of different sizes and activities of different kinds. Another lesson that again runs counter to standard practice for urban designers, right? Which is that there tend to be, because of these block patterns and the fact that you have these one-story buildings plopped down, a lot of weird leftover spaces. And of course, the instinct of the urban designer is to kind of clean all this up and rationalize it. And what we would argue is that while we want to link these in various ways, these irregular kind of leftover spaces are exactly the kinds of places that animate the true working district. These kind of alleys like you see here on the right, or this image. Again, I was also happy to see Susan Chin in this because she'll recognize this image in the garment district, looking at how to take these kind of leftover slots of spaces between these giant loft buildings and actually connect them into something, but not to fill them in or to close them out. Another thing is to try to create a connected street network within the district, because even if it's irregular, to maintain some level of connectivity, because there are certain practices that have to do with goods movement, certain sustainability practices that have to do with stormwater management, or shared energy systems that actually do benefit from connectivity. But what we think is possible, if you look at that middle row, is this idea of, even as we connect to the surrounding street network, to create what we're calling sort of virtual superblocks. We don't want to go back to the old practice of closing off streets to create superblocks, but you can create these semi-porous precincts that are basically limited to industrial traffic and industrial activities, but still enable pedestrian and visual connectivity to the surrounding network. Another lesson learned is to find those selected streets and public spaces that are worth animating. This does not mean transforming the whole district into this beautiful walking environment that you would find elsewhere in the city. But there may be some key connecting corridor where you double down in terms of how the degree to which you try to link the leftover open spaces that are along that corridor, or demand that more of those buildings become transparent, allow people to see what is going on inside, and so that it hangs together, at least loosely, as a corridor. So that goes, so here's an example, just a before and after kind of sketch by one of our authors, and a diagram in the design guideline portion of the atlas of picking one street perhaps where you begin to engage in a bunch of strategies, not to clean it up, but to begin to have some kind of uniform relationship with the street, perhaps putting more retail or for that business, factory outlet kind of activities, things that are more transparent and more active along the street, and begin linking some of the leftover open spaces. Another lesson, extremely important, is to make manufacturing visible. People do not understand that things are still getting made in the city, and that makes it very difficult to advocate for keeping it. And it is possible to take the one-story box and open it up and enable people to see what's going on inside. People like seeing this stuff, and it raises its, not just its literal profile, but its political profile in the city. There is a kind of idea that one of our authors, Giovanna Fosso, talks about in her essay about the Milan region, of a kind of, new kind of grand tour that is built up around kind of industrial tourism of the making of things and how they are made. And so that's another interesting architectural challenge, is how do you do that? Another lesson learned is, if we want to create amenities in the district, and we do, right? You don't want to, many of these places are kind of dark and dirty and they're not good working environments. And we want to make them better working environments, and in selected areas, places where people can come and see the making of things. But you want to create amenities that are really oriented towards the workers, that are places where they can have lunch to take lunch breaks, right? This is not about building beautiful parks where people can come with their strollers. It's about taking a lot of these leftover spaces often, and making it possible for people to actually work outside in a collaborative way. So that's a different set of place making interventions that is different than what the typical urban designer would do. Another lesson learned is to design streets that enable pedestrian amenity, but prioritize and celebrate goods movement. And this is again to acknowledge the Design Trust and their work they did in the Garment District. If you go to the Garment District, part of what happens there is you see people rolling these carts down the street with clothes on them. And, we felt like, well, maybe we should be branding the district with that kind of activity. And we should have a special kind of bike lane striped. That's not a bike lane so much as it is a bike lane, but it's also a lane where it's possible to move goods between stores or down the streets, as a way of celebrating it and acknowledging the activities there. And it's also important to remember that while we have our standard urban design palette of street trees and things like that, we have to understand that loading operations, that kind of goods movement might trump some of the standard things that we would normally want to do. One really interesting study that is in one of our graphic sections of the book is this one that was done by the Department of City Planning. And what they did was, this idea of mixed use in time and space. And they looked at, well, these crazy mixed use streets, is there a way that we could strike a balance between kind of rationalizing all of it the way an urban designer would like to, and also making it kind of contingent on kind of the changing mixed land use patterns? And so what they did was they developed this kind of kit of parts that you see here on the left, both for frontage types and for street elements. And they kind of, like in a board game, there's a couple of board games I can think of like this, where you have to match pieces in order to string them together. And it raises this really interesting idea about, well, where does the public realm begin and end, and where does the private realm begin and end? And I think it's that kind of contingent mixed use idea for street design, which is really compelling. And again, in the Garment District, we had this idea about streets being used not just as streets, but as runways during Fashion Week. So streets could be designed anticipating those different kinds of uses at different times of the day. And maybe most important is managing the edge. We developed a typology of edge types that you probably recognize if you know these districts. The sort of hard edge, where all of a sudden you have little houses confronting one of those long one-story windowless walls. A kind of soft edge where you can't quite tell what's going on. And then the mixed edge where you have things on both sides. And I think if you look at this map, this is from a study that we did with Pratt as part of a studio looking at East Williamsburg. And if you look at the land use pattern there, those different colors represent businesses of different kinds. And I said, okay, for the purposes of zoning, we need to draw a line on the map. Where are you going to draw it? It's not clear. And so you have to figure out, well, part of that kind of edge, which is, again, sort of part soft, part hard, kind of neither one nor the other, is a great transition from the solid residential neighborhood here to some of the very heavy industrial uses that are back in here. And so we have we have a bunch of suggestions in the atlas and the design guidelines about the idea of trying to create the boundaries between these districts in places where it enables better street design. So maybe you have an industrial street and the transition to the neighborhood happens in the alleyway in the back. This happens in a number of the case studies we looked at. Or you have the odd industrial building that's poking out from the industrial district. Is there a way to line it in such a way that you make a better street? And this again is from design, one of the design or illustrations in the book that is about this idea about clipping residential uses along the residential street onto the production box in order to manage the transition from the residential neighborhood to the industrial neighborhood. And let's say this, and this might be something that would apply to the kind of soft edge we were just looking at East Williamsburg, this idea of creating an overlay zone where you have a set of special requirements and guidelines in place that enable you to maintain this mixed character of both residential and industrial buildings. And so with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and pass it on to Nina for the second half of the talk.
Nina, you're still muted.
To continue with the concepts that Rob discussed and that we analyzed in our new book, one of the themes that I was interested in was thinking about industry as infrastructure. And one of these aspects is that we really feel that we don't think that manufacturing should be isolated anymore the way it once was. And this is just an amazing image of the island in Japan that was once a coal mine and a place to live for the workers. And it really is this isolated enclave of manufacturing. And we really think it can't be sequestered like this anymore, except for maybe the really super, super heavy extraction industries. And instead, in cities, we believe in this vibrant mixed use of manufacturing, like thinking about Jane Jacobs and her ideas of these dynamic cities and the kind of the messy places that Rob discussed, that really the city is a diverse place and manufacturing can be more dispersed. So this is an amazing map of New York from around the 1920s, and it really shows how manufacturing is distributed around New York City. It's sometimes clustered, of course, like in the garment district, but the factory really has an ecosystem and a network throughout the city for its supply chain, for the energy systems, for the workers, for the goods, for the waste, and also for the innovation. So we've been looking at how this manufacturing can be dispersed in a different kind of spatial organization that for today's new economy really stresses often the small, the clean, again, the potential for visibility in what I call the spectacle of manufacturing, and the potential for hybrid. So that the new kind of manufacturing really allows for a new kind of spatial organization, both at the district scale that Rob's been talking about, at the city scale, but also at the building scale. And so one of the examples I love still is Cedric Price's Pottery Stink Belt, which was the repurposing of the existing networks and industrial networks in the pottery district in Staffordshire, England, that he was turning into an education center. But I think this kind of networked system could be also used for cities. And the other spatial interest today is, of course, how do we create a circular economy out of new manufacturing? how is that both a spatial system, but also an environmental system, and how that environmental and spatial then can be linked in cities in a kind of metabolism, or what's called industrial symbiosis. So we ask, as Rob mentioned, what is made in cities today? How do we kind of promote what's being made in cities so that city officials, policymakers, economists really understand that there is this potential to keep these kinds of industries? And of course, they're growing up on their own. We see entrepreneurs, especially in new ways of making food, small pickle shops, small coffee producers, or fashion, furniture makers that relate to people living in cities, or film production, and all of the myriad of production sites for carpentry, for costumes, that really need to be close to the innovators and the places that are producing. Of course, then there's smaller fabrication, prototyping that relates to Industry 4.0. And then, of course, we still do have large scale legacy companies that are in cities because, that's where they are. It's too expensive for them to move, and that's what they care about. So we see, though, this kind of smaller tool and smaller spaces that are allowing manufacturing to be in cities. And the scale of machinery shifts from the large scale. Even robots have shrunk in size. As architecture students, you're working with 3D printers at a very small scale, and this is happening in the factory too. The idea that Rob mentioned of the network of a digital supply chain, the digital production that then gets made somewhere else is all over the world now, and this small scale allows then for spaces to be smaller. And one example I love is that of the diamond, which is the smallest, most expensive object that is processed, not of course extracted, but produced in cities like Antwerp, Rotterdam, and New York. Or the smaller scale machine shops where you have really high tech machinery, and that doesn't need so much space. And so we're seeing the shift from the behemoth factories like those in Cleveland and Dearborn, Michigan, of Albert Kahn, giant suburban factories from the 20s to the 50s, really shifting to a smaller scale in smaller workshops back in urban centers. And so these huge factory sites, this is in Ghent in Belgium, are really not necessary, but they start to get divided up into smaller units. One of these great examples as a new possibility for a project is the Nerd building, which is where Freitag bags are made in Switzerland, right outside of Zurich, in an industrial zone where the Freitag bag is like the anchor tenant, and they have a major part of the space, but then there are smaller units inside where smaller companies can then grow and be innovative, and they create this great community of workers. So this is an example of, say, a new kind of what I call vertical urban factory, but it's occupied with multiple companies. So this other concept of making production visible is something that we feel is very important in cities, as Rob mentioned, for policy, but because too that really people love watching stuff get made. And sometimes they don't know why. And I talk with my students about it, and we always come up with the conclusion that it's kind of magic, right? Watching a raw material become a finished good. It's morphing into something else. So people love watching the stuff get made. They have, since early automotive tours in factories in the US and in Germany. But also making production visible means that the worker is also on view, and it creates improved labor rights. And also the idea of the industrial commons can be formed because people are working together and seeing each other. So one great example, at the really high end of the spectacular is something like Zaha Hadid's addition to the factory in Leipzig, Germany, where she put the conveyor belt through the middle of the factory so that as a visitor, as a tourist, you can see the cars on the production line. Or a concept that I came up with vertical urban factory for the what would happen if the garment district had glass walls and you could see inside into the shops, and that would create, you know, better equity for the workers there. You really wouldn't have the sweatshop anymore. And wouldn't it be fun, really, to see this animated in the streetscape? Or the spectacle of production that's really part of the experience economy. We all want to buy experiences now, not just you know, buy an object. So looking at the making of things becomes something that cities really should capitalize on. What if all the empty storefronts, you know, now from COVID, were filled with people making things instead of lying empty? Here's an example in Zurich, Switzerland, where it's a youth center, and they actually have welding classes right outside on the street so that people can come by and see it and maybe be inspired to take a class. Or the place of eating together in a factory environment is something that other people can join in, a cafe for the workers, like Rob mentioned, but also a place where other people can go. And then we look at a project like Bubbly Dynamics in Chicago as one of the case studies in the book, where sustainable production, where eco-production, where producing food becomes a neighborhood event, and is something that the people in the community can participate in, but also what they're making is part of a kind of closed loop system that relates to both the energy use, the use of the plant life, creating different food and drink breweries that then are also consumed in the neighborhood. But again, on the left here, provide jobs. So this main goal in urban industry is also to provide jobs for a workforce that needs these places to work and skills. So we look at and discuss a great deal in this section on the architecture of the factory, of how can we possibly maintain manufacturing in buildings in the cities any longer when you know, the highest and best use of the land is really residential. And so there are a couple of strategies again that exist, right? These are not things we're inventing, but these are things that we're really kind of identifying as a way to maintain urban manufacturing. And one of them is to have flexible spaces that we call the neo-cottage industry, hybrid spaces, vertical urban factories, places of commoning, industrial commoning, ways that we can have mandatory industrial use. And we'll get into a tiny bit later too, this idea of performance zoning, where buildings are evaluated on a case-by-case basis rather than having blanket zoning codes. So just to highlight a couple of these ideas, the flexible neo-cottage is something that we see in many places in cities. It's really this idea of a multi-tenanted building that can be newly developed or can be something that's re-inhabited. And with that, it often takes a mission-driven organization, whether it's a city agency or a nonprofit, to run that building. And one of these that's a great success is the UI Labs in Chicago, which was an Obama-funded project to encourage innovation, incubation, sharing of best practices between really large-scale companies. You know, this is like the IBMs are joining this lab, but as a result, they get out of their like $1 million contribution to it, they get shared equipment, they get to test. When I was there, they were testing virtual reality repair in a factory, using new virtual tools and equipment so that they could then bring it back to their own space. And then it's a networking opportunity. So it's not just competitive, but there's also sharing. Other kinds of spaces is this amazing initiative by the French government in Paris that's been around since the late 80s, Hotel Industrial, and the government actually had a competition, invited architects to design mixed-use manufacturing spaces for multi-tenants. And here, some of the things that Rob was talking about too is, besides the transit, but also bringing the delivery off of the street into courtyards, creating blocks where manufacturing could happen without ruining a residential neighborhood. This is a new project in Geneva, the same idea of multi-tenanted industrial space in a new building where they had shared courtyards and spaces to interact, retail on the ground floor. Or right in New York City, the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center, which started as a collective of furniture makers and as a nonprofit, has now grown to own about 7 buildings in and around New York, where they're small workshops. It's small scale, small batch. They have lean production. They don't need big warehousing. And so they can occupy these smaller units within the larger building. And this is their newest building. I was lucky to go to the opening in January before COVID. And it's a fabulous space, also an early concrete New York City building. Inside here is one of the workers just setting up shop, but you can see they have ample space, and the rent's a lot cheaper, which is one of the key issues. In Philadelphia, there's Globe Dye. That's a private version of this with multi-use space, different tenants who then fit out the space themselves. You can see it's not a fancy place to work. Or something like the old Ansaldo factory, which was a huge train steel company, a giant complex in the city, taking over blocks and blocks that Giovanna Fossa talks about in the chapter in the book, that is now a mixed-use workspace that is also the production space for the costumes of La Scala Theater and the sets for La Scala Theater. They make the amazing theater backdrops here, but there's also a museum, there's co-working space, and offices. Or when we think about the industrial commons, where people are making and working together, again, sharing tools because they're so expensive. These industrial commons or maker spaces or fab labs, you pay a fee to be a member, and in exchange, you can use the equipment. This is one in Seoul, Korea, and then they create these environments like in Shenzhen, where the electronic stores and retail collectives where people are buying and selling goods. Or on the right, Stefan Ahl and Jonathan Bach in the book created these drawings showing also this potential for mixed use in these neighborhoods. Again, Next Fab in Philadelphia, a great success. Or San Francisco, SF Made in San Francisco, which really modeled and got their advice and their model from Greenpoint Manufacturing Design Center as a nonprofit mission-driven organization, building a new building for mixed-use manufacturing spaces. Again, another just incubator spaces have been very popular. They've really been around since the 60s. One thinks of Cambridge and other areas that were formerly industrial or have a large university nearby, where they're sharing technology, creating spaces of work now to come up with new ideas, but also to get support in terms of business management, how to get into the marketplace, and how to sell their goods. This is an example of this one. It's kind of a funky, hipster space, but one that's very functional and adaptive. Again, this smaller space in this larger factory building. The kind of last example of how we can fit manufacturing into different kinds of spaces is to think about working and living together. Historically, it's from proto-industry. It's the shop house. It's the house and the workshop next to each other, or it's the shop and the workshop, combined, where there's an outdoor workspace near a small apartment building or near a home in a city like Barcelona or Torino, Italy, where they're working and living in the same space because it was more convenient. This was the original cottage industry. And today we can have these two. This is a project that's both a hybrid structure, but has potential for them working and living in these same volumes. Or here, design studies that Vertical Urban Factory did of showing how we can have potentially residential in the taller building and manufacturing in the lower building with shared space in between, or including all together in one building, so that maybe the offset of the residential and the higher price of the residential can offset that cost of the industrial space. Or here, this example too of also incorporating a sustainable concept where the water use and heat use from the factory can then be kind of recycled or repurposed in the residential component of the building, so that the building itself is a closed loop system, but so is the processing that's going on inside, so that again, you can have manufacturing on the ground floor, commercial in the middle, and residential on top, and that can help to fund or support the manufacturing space. And this actually was achieved in one of the only really new projects in North America. In Vancouver, they created a building that is at the edge of an industrial neighborhood, just like what Rob was discussing, where this softer edge between the industry and the residential then kind of merged together to create a building that represented that. So here we have on the ground floor the commercial and manufacturing space in these large open spaces with good truck delivery on one side, and then residential in the tower that's more high end, and medium income residential in the other two towers, so that they're cross subsidizing the manufacturing use. And as a result, what we see with working and living in close proximity, we're saving also on energy use, on transportation use. The workers are close to home. It doesn't mean that you live in the space necessarily where you work like we are now, but that they're nearby. And it really, you know, it does all the things that we're seeing happening, the positive sides to working and living in the new space, because there's then a greener footprint. So this interest in mixing use then creates these more vital, denser, kind of messy neighborhoods that we all love. Not everyone does, but that it creates this kind of counter to standard practice that Rob mentioned, but it also creates this vitality and also encourages incubating and entrepreneurship for more dynamic and innovative cities. So some of the policies that we looked at too in the last section of the book includes those I discussed, but you know, what policies can cities use to do this? Sometimes mixed districts don't work because, again, the residential wins out. So instead of just saying, let's have a mixed use district, there actually needs to be a mandatory statement that says industry has to be part of the mix. Or we can think about distributed or clustered industries again, where there would be a method to create sustainable industries. Then, of course, there are land use regulations that we can look at, like performance zoning or land banking, where cities, I think in Cleveland, there are some good land banks actually, where the neighborhoods and the cities are buying land that they can then determine what can be done with it. And it can be used for industrial use, or the transfer of development rights, unused development rights that can be used for manufacturing. Then, of course, there are direct subsidies, subsidies to local manufacturers, and subsidies to create workforce training and training to increase the ability of lower schooled people to enter the workforce. So what we're hoping with this work and with our book is that planners, academics, regular citizens can learn from these examples and learn from these case studies to increase and maintain industry in cities as a way to then create a more mixed and vibrant environment. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Nina and Rob. That was incredible. I urge everyone to do one of these or their emojis, their emoji clapping. That was great. I'm gonna urge everyone either here on the Zoom or on the live stream to please send any questions that you have. There was a lot. It was really all interesting, and I'm sure there are tons of thoughts and ideas that folks are having, especially given how important these topics are for our region in the world. So I'll wait a second, and if I don't see a question, I might just throw one. Mrs. Susan Chin asks, how do you change public and policy makers' mindsets about new urban manufacturing who see it as gentrification, such as what's happening currently in Industry City in Sunset Park in Brooklyn?
Do you want to do that, Rob?
So I think, I mean, because Susan, through the Design Trust, all of us have been kind of fighting this battle for a long time. I think, and probably Susan has, maybe she has better answers to her own question than I have. I think, again, I think that there's a huge education campaign. I think that the vast majority of New Yorkers, if you ask them, you know, what's the future of manufacturing in New York City, they'd say it's gone. It doesn't exist. And I just think we've been terrible at telling the story of manufacturing in New York, and of sort of trying to show how important it is, but also just like engaging people in the opportunity to see things being made and having people understand where the products that they use and so on actually come from. So for me, I would say that there is a big kind of public education campaign that, you know, all of us, including the Design Trust and ITAC and Adam Friedman, who's one of the authors in the book, have been working at. But I think we have to go a lot further in terms of raising the profile of manufacturing and production of all kinds. And I also think some of it is, you know, getting away from the word manufacturing to some extent and getting into the idea of production writ large, making people understand that it's, you know, there is a lot of stuff that has to do with making physical architectural products for architecture or equipment for the MTA. You know, there's some successful companies that do that. But there are also other kinds of production, lightweight 3D printing activities and things like that that need to be embraced and will create a bigger audience and bigger, you know, partnership for urban manufacturing.
Yeah, as to Susan's question, though, you know, Industry City wants to put in hotels and non-industrial uses. So I think that that's the challenge there. We talked about this the other day too. So they're interested in other uses. We know that Andrew Kimball, who also wrote an essay for the book, Andrew Kimball is the director of Industry City in Brooklyn. And for those of you who don't know, you know, it was a huge industrial area. They inserted more factories back into it and artist spaces, but now they have so much land, they want to really develop the site. And his heart is in industry, but he knows that he can't survive on it. So in a way, it's this kind of back and forth. Again, you have to have something that's going to pay for that industrial space. I'm going to answer, I see the questions coming in, Stephen Ruggieri's question. Should I do that?
Invite Susan to give some thoughts on this, given that Susan, like everyone's been saying, has been thinking and talking about that. The project in which I was a fellow for Design Trust when Susan was the executive director was in front of Industry City. So I'm sure that Susan has lots of thoughts, and I thought I would invite her to give a thought on that.
Thanks, Killian. And thank you all for your little shout outs. I think the work that you all have done as fellows for the Design Trust was really transformative, and glad to hear this in-depth presentation about new industrial vertical factory thinking. Industry City really sought to reuse and incorporate many of the principles that Rob and Nina had laid out. So, it was about local manufacturing, local sourcing, and then also selling on site in the neighborhood and creating jobs in the neighborhood. But the perception by the neighborhood was really so insurmountable that now Industry City has actually pulled out. Jamestown, the original developer, has pulled out, which looks, you look at the future and say, what for this huge complex, right? Nina, you talked about those large buildings being subdivided. Now, how do we see the next chapter? Who is going to take this on? Is it the role of government? Is it the role of a private developer? And maybe it's whoever, Killian, maybe it depends on who is actually creating the project that creates the transparency and trust that is developed in the community for such a huge development. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I have to say, I didn't realize, I knew that they failed to get the zoning, the special zoning that they wanted. I didn't realize, I have to say, that Jonestown had actually pulled out. Now, are they selling when you say?
Yeah, I haven't heard any more, Rob, and I don't want to make this just a conversation between the two of us. Maybe time for, just following up and I guess to some of these other folks on this presentation, how do you think about those post-industrial buildings or that are going to be newly renovated as new industry buildings? How do we think about who takes on the lead?
I think that what we've found is that you need to have a mission-driven organization that has a steady source of funding that can curate what goes on in the building. I just think there are a lot of, we talk in the book about a lot of various kind of market-based mechanisms for TDR and so on. But at the end of the day, because the kind of highest and best use formula breaks down, because a lot of the value of manufacturing is not incorporated in the products and the prices, I think you have to have a mission-driven organization that controls the real estate at some level.
And that's why the incubators work so well. I mean, Industry City, I'm sure they'll figure out what to do next with all that space, but business incubators, other businesses, but it takes a lot of work to find the people who will occupy it. And, look at Brooklyn Navy Yard. They're doing it. And that was that was Andrew Kimball as well. So I do think that there is a place to do this. In a funny way, it's this combination of these huge, large-scale, megalithic industrial spaces that have trouble filling it, but then the other manufacturing spaces like the garment district too are then empty. So there's this odd mix right now that's going on in cities, I think, in the different kinds of spaces.
And to generalize it and take it out of New York, which I think Susan is right to do, because New York is a very peculiar and particular administrative and governmental and physical place. What you can do, it has a lot to do with your local capacity. The policies and the zoning and the guidelines need to be calibrated to the capabilities of the people who are going to be administering it. So in Berkeley, for example, we found that they were quite progressive, they're quite progressive and quite successful, as they are in Portland and the Central East Side, of maintaining kind of urban manufacturing in these kind of mixed use environments. And they have a lot of language that's very soft, about, well, will the new use enhance or detract from the kind of overall industrial character and culture of the place? Well, in New York City, there is no one in New York City who wants to be in the position of having to make that kind of value judgment, because New York is a very particular climate in terms of the way zoning is administered. But in other cities, including Portland and Berkeley and others, they're not afraid to have some of those soft criteria and to have the city do some of the curating, not just the private mission-driven entity. So it really varies a lot, we found, across the country in terms of how the degree to which they were going to depend on use lists for what's allowed and not allowed and so on, versus more of a performance kind of oriented qualitative approach to managing it.
This is a fascinating conversation and goes to the heart, and even in areas that are very different, like Cleveland. The pressures and the real estate value and everything is very different, but the idea is that people observe that certain districts have benefited some folks while not benefiting others. It's in the air. Everywhere is being a conversation, even in places where there's lots of empty land, lots of even vacant buildings. So thank you for the conversation. I know it's 1 o'clock and I appreciate everyone staying on. We'll probably go another 5 minutes if that's okay with everyone, and answer a few more questions. Nina, you were beginning to answer the next one, and around industrial tourism and its possibilities, and I don't know.
Yes, sure. So yeah, industrial tourism hasn't died. It's still a big thing. There are companies that do it. I gave a series of tours for Open House New York now like 4 years ago. They were sold out. In Germany, they do them constantly, in Italy. So I do think it is something that cities should capitalize on. The hard thing is sometimes getting the permission to go into the factories. So we find that when I organize these tours, it's a lot of work to get the company to agree because of insurance, because you're interfering with their workday. The workers don't want to be interrupted, but other companies do them on a regular basis and they have a system worked out. So I do see that something that each city could have. In Germany, one city has open industry days, the way we have open architecture days. And I think it's a great thing for cities to take advantage of.
Thank you so much. I feel like Adrian Hill's question maybe got a little bit of an answer from Rob, especially about these mission-driven groups, but I'm gonna read it anyway and see if there's anything you wanna add, Rob. In terms of urban design and industrial land, does Inform follow heavily finance in mixed or inner city locations? Who's the actor that should be responsible for moderating the design principles shown in Rob's presentation?
So I'm reading the question as well. I want to make sure I understand the first part of it. Does Inform follow finance in mixed or inner city locations? I'm not exactly sure what is meant by that, but I would say that in terms of the design guidelines that are in our book, I think most of those are actually drawn up. I don't know, Adrian, if you've seen them. They are actually drawn up in ways that could be incorporated into a code as design guidelines. And so I actually think they are specific enough that they could withstand kind of a standard administrative review in most cities. So I think that but I think the real challenge is that is not the formal guidelines, which I think one can put in place and make quite quantitative for an administrative review process. But I guess the point is, even getting those form things correct in and of themselves is not going to guarantee that you have this active culture of manufacturing that we've been talking about. So I would say that the physical form pieces are a necessary but not sufficient condition for urban retention and manufacturing. And it's really the policy things that we've been talking about having a mission-driven organization and so on, that in the end will make it work.
I have kind of what seems, and all these are basically very different variations of the same question, but they're all really interesting. Next is Caitlin Boniacki, who is a student at Kent State University, who's doing her thesis around this and works with us at the CUDC on a couple of manufacturing and new industrial systems that we're working on. Do you see the development of localized embedded industrial districts as a way to target some of the growing inequities in our society? How do we reinvest in communities that have been abandoned by big industrial corporations?
Yes, I would say that, again, I mean, it's really interesting with this. It does depend on the companies and the people running the companies. So the trick is to find companies who want to come back to these urban centers to take advantage of the workforce and to have a good heart to reinvest in the communities where companies have been pulled out. I mean, kind of like Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati too. How do you build up something that's kind of been taken down? So I do think it can work. I think it is a public-private venture. I think nonprofits probably are the way to go in that kind of situation, or coalitions of urban manufacturers, and really pull them together to kind of start a new organizational system, whether it's an incubator or a makerspace, or just a series of smaller manufacturers.
In the book, in the interest of sort of being honest with ourselves and our audience, the beginning of the book, where we talk about urban manufacturing in general, we list the 3 or 4 classic arguments for why manufacturing has to be in the city. And one of them, of course, is that it produces all of these opportunities for advancement, which it does. But with each of those propositions, we also put in italics below them the qualifying thing that you have to say. And the qualifying thing is that the higher value manufacturing things that are the most likely to do really, really well in the city also require a corresponding level of increased workforce training. And I think that I think that it is true that the days when, you know, anyone could kind of get a job in a factory or an assembly line and sort of start climbing the ladder, I don't really quite believe that anymore, because of the role that technology is playing. A lot of jobs, a lot of people say a lot of these jobs are going to go away as they become more automated. And so again, I think we need to expand our ideas about what we think urban production is, and it needs to be linked to workforce training, to think about workers as infrastructure also, and training them to be able to participate in these things that we're making available to them.
I think I'm going to combine the last 2 questions by Dennis Whittier and Barbara Carr. Number 1 is, given the societal implications of leaving buildings vacant, should we encourage retrofitting or mixed-use new construction? And then also Barbara, for some work that she's doing in Fort Myers, Florida, she's asking master developers, or is this allowing many involved in the development? So kind of 2 questions about renovation versus new, a master plan and kind of doing it all at once, or breaking up and doing many. So
yeah, I definitely, I do a lot of talks and have done a bit of research on the reuse of existing buildings. And yes, we have the bubbly dynamics is in our book, and I mentioned it today. So I think it's, as a preservationist too, I think retrofitting, reusing historic existing factories is a wonderful way to go. It's cheaper, it's possible, it's been done, and yes, and it can be mixed use. And then in Fort Myers, fabulous. It would be great if you could do something. I think allowing many developers helps. I think all of these ideas are, you know, in a way, how do we stay nimble how do we stay flexible? How do we kind of move with this rise and fall of economies, especially today, to allow for that potential for change? What if someone backs out? What if you don't get a tenant? I think that all of these things need to be taken into account with the economy as it is, especially now.
And I'll just add briefly that in all of the case studies that we looked at, all of the really successful innovation districts, and of course the flagship is at 21, or is it at 22 in Barcelona. It's about this kind of hybrid condition of building on the existing fabric. So I don't think it's like either or. I think you can replace parts of buildings, you can clip on, you can add, but all of the innovation, the really successful innovation districts, none of them were built from whole cloth. And indeed, if you think about regular neighborhoods, how many examples can you think of new neighborhoods built of whole cloth that actually feel like a piece of the city? It's about the hardest thing that there is to do. So I think it's very much about kind of everywhere and all at once at small scale, and building on the existing fabric as much as you possibly can.
With that, thank you so much, Nina and Rob. This is done for any of these, which talks about how rich the subject is, how much you put on our plates, and how important it is for many communities. Again, here, I think in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, we're having lots of conversations about these very subjects. And hopefully we can engage you in some of those in the future. Thank you again. Your book has become a little bit of our Bible here. Even bought it for students. And it's really, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for everyone who attended. Again, I put the link on the chat. We invite you to join us for next week's the last conversation. It will be moderated by the Architectural League of New York, and it will include 3 groups that are doing American Roundtable projects, including us, me mostly, doing in the Mahoney Valley, and questions around the future of work in that area, an all industrial steel area that now, where many of those kind of jobs have left. So with that, I appreciate everyone, and thank you so much, and have
It's good to see you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.